So I made the news this morning, and we might as well talk about me being the news story of the day. I talked to folks within the Trump administration to try to understand why we would vote with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea against a resolution calling Russia the aggressor in Ukraine. I want to explain to you the thinking of the Trump administration from talking to multiple people within the Trump administration on their thinking for voting against that resolution. Now, I know what happens when I do this. People see an excerpt of this and they say, oh, you're a Trump apologist, you're a Trump defender. Why are you defending Hitler? Or the Trump guys get mad when I say, look, I disagree. And here's why I disagree. Oh, you're never a Trumper or whatever. I would just note that all the people who call me never a Trumper never gave Donald Trump as much money as I did, but they just can't let the past go and recognize realignment. But I am perfectly comfortable disagreeing with the Trump administration and perfectly willing to tell you, even as I can analyze their thinking and talk to people, many of whom are longtime friends of mine, about the thinking, so at least you understand their thinking. So all of those caveats getting into here, let's say whether you agree or disagree, and let me stake out my position and plant my flag at the beginning, just so you know, I can disagree while also be as fair and objective as possible in navigating the situation. I do not think the United States of America should ever side with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea, three of the biggest authoritarian regimes on planet Earth. Even China and Iran had the good sense to abstain from the UN General Assembly resolution calling for an end to the war in Ukraine and noting Russia as the aggressor. Marco Rubio essentially said the resolution had too many aggressive words in it. That was his public statement. The fact of the matter is Russia is the aggressor, and this language does matter for purposes of international law, where if the United Nations says Russia is the aggressor, when the war is over and territory is ceded from Russia, Ukraine still maintains a claim to it, and that essentially gets to where we're headed with the logic here. So I don't think it's a good day when the United States sides with three tyrannies around the world, all three of which have invaded Ukraine. We actually sided with the three countries that have invaded Ukraine, and I don't think that's a good look for us. But I recognize there is a method to the madness. Whether I agree or not with the resolution, I understand there's a method to the madness here. It is not contrary to claims. It is not contrary to claims that we're doing the bidding of Russia. And I need to pause here and say this. There are many, many, many people who are absolutely convinced because of their hatred of Donald Trump that he is somehow in Vladimir Putin's pocket. Vladimir Putin has a P-tape on him or something. I don't think that's the case at all. And I think the gut reaction of, oh, we're carrying water for Russia because there are people in the Trump administration who believe we can somehow bring Russia back into the Western fold and back into Europe, or because of cultural issues that they are sympathetic to Russia. People have persistently been poisoned on the idea of Donald Trump and Russia. And I don't think Donald Trump is a traitor to the United States. I do not think Donald Trump is in Russia's pocket. I think that Donald Trump oftentimes sees the world differently from many other people, particularly among the elite and the establishment, and decides to rethink issues. And there used to be a time in this country where people were heralded for rethinking issues, and Donald Trump gets sorely attacked. There are times I agree with him. There are times I disagree with him, and I'm willing to tell you which is which. But I'm also willing to explain the thinking, and let me do that for you with the Ukraine situation. What Donald Trump is doing on the world stage is recognizing we have a problem left over from the Obama administration. The problem is that Barack Obama made a conscious decision when he was president that we should end the two-war doctrine. The two-war doctrine had been settled American military doctrine since the end of World War II, that the United States at all times and all ways should be prepared to fight a war and win a war on two fronts at the same time. Our entire military buildup post-World War II was about being able to fight in the Pacific theater and the Atlantic theater, in Europe and in Asia at the same time, concurrently, and win both wars. And what Barack Obama, genius military pothead strategist that he was, decided is that what the United States should be able to do is fight two wars at one time, hold one front long enough to win the other war, and then redivert the resources to the other front and win it. There is a growing belief in the United States military that we don't have the capacity to do that right now, and we haven't for some time. The supply chain is screwed up. Shipbuilding is off the rails. It's not good. Military aircraft aren't functional. We've got all sorts of problems in addition to recruitment problems. And right now, the United States sees China as the biggest threat. So what Donald Trump would like to do is resolve a situation in Europe so that he can pivot to dealing with the problems that are coming up in the Pacific. That you have to understand as a presuppositional thinking to everything else is the Trump administration's primary concern is China, not Russia. We'll get into why I disagree a little bit later, but that's your presupposition to understand everything else. So, with that being the concerns, here's why we voted against the resolution in the United Nations. One, the Trump administration believes, and they're not wrong, that Ukraine has been trying to essentially win a PR war, not just a real war. They want a PR war with the West, and so Ukraine was the agent behind the resolution, they say, got European powers on board, and this was all about a performative statement, not a real thing. Whether the resolution passed or failed was meaningless, but Ukraine could feel like it got a PR victory. Donald Trump doesn't want to give Ukraine PR victories. Donald Trump wants to end a war. By siding with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea, he's signaling to Ukraine, your PR stunts are over. You're going to come to a table and negotiate. The other thing is they want the Europeans to understand. In fact, we passed a Security Council resolution, which is binding. General Assembly resolutions of the UN not binding. Security Council resolutions are. The Security Council resolution calls for an end to the war and does not assign blame. The European powers abstained from it. They could have vetoed it, and they didn't. They abstained from it. Russia and the United States voted for a resolution calling for an end to the war. What Donald Trump is doing with that is signaling to Europe that if you want to keep the war going, you're going to pay for it. We're done paying for it. If you want to keep investing in Ukraine and keep sending arms to Ukraine, go for it, but we're done. The third thing that Donald Trump wanted to do by siding with the Russians was to tell the Russians very visibly through performance, we're not Joe Biden. You can come sit at the table with us and negotiate. The Putin regime would not in any way, shape, or form sit down with the Biden regime to have any sort of peaceful negotiation. What Donald Trump, by siding with the Russians on these resolutions, was saying is like, listen, we're willing to give you a fair hearing. We're not Joe Biden. So to Ukraine, no PR wins. You're going to have to sit at the table. To Russia, you can sit at the table with us. And to Europe, we're not going to play this game anymore. If you want to fund the war, we're done. In the back of all of the thinking is this. We must resolve the situation in Europe so we can turn our attention to China while we try to rebuild our military to go back to a two-front, two-war doctrine. Again, you can disagree with their thinking. You can disagree, and I do disagree with them siding with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea when even China and Iran said, we're not touching that. But I at least understand their thinking. Now, there's a caveat to the thinking that you also have to understand, and this from multiple people inside the Trump administration. They believe Donald Trump wants to try to find a peaceful resolution, and Donald Trump wants to show he can do this, just like he did with the Abraham Accords. Concurrently, very few people in the Trump administration actually trust the Russians. In fact, it is members of the Trump administration who make the most persuasive case for Vladimir Putin not wanting to end the war. So how does all this resolve itself? Because there's a paradox here. Trump wants to end the war. Vladimir Putin might not want to end the war. Trump is siding with the Russians to get him to the table, and the Russians may drag it out. So what do you do? And the bottom line is that if it becomes clear to the Trump administration that Vladimir Putin has no desire to really end the war, that we will move swiftly and decisively to help Ukraine. We will, after all, have mineral rights in Ukraine. Here's where I stake out my position. Putin doesn't want to end the war for a couple of reasons. Putin is very convinced he can still win this war. Putin is fed, remember, a lot of information that's not quite accurate. but Putin believes that he can wear down American resolve to help in Ukraine, and that it is only the American arsenal that is allowing Ukraine to stay relevant in the fight. Right now, Ukraine is firing parity bullets at Russia, bullet for bullet. Ukraine can reciprocate with Russia. For a time there, when our aid slowed down during government shutdown debates and things like that, that for every 7 bullets that Russia was firing, Ukraine was firing 3, and Ukraine fell back. Now, just at parity, Ukraine has advanced again. The Ukrainians are outperforming their manpower in a way the Russians can't. The other reason that Vladimir Putin wants to stay in the fight is because he doesn't want to resettle thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of criminal soldiers who've now fought on a battlefield and are no longer scared of death and willing to commit crimes. He doesn't want those people repatriating to Russia. He wants them to stay in Ukraine. So either he's going to leave them there if we do a land swap with Ukraine for settlement, or he's going to keep the war going. But Putin, at the end of the day, is still convinced he can win the war. He could also win the war by doing something like the Budapest Accord, where Ukraine, remember, they gave up their armaments, they gave up their nukes. The U.S. and Russia said, we'll protect you. The Russians didn't protect them. Instead, they invaded and took Crimea. Vladimir Putin is playing a much longer game, and that's the other thing that the Trump administration is aware of, is they are playing a 4-year game, because then Donald Trump is out of office. Vladimir Putin, God knows how long he stays in office. He's a dictator. But ultimately, what all of this is about is Trump wants a good faith effort to try to bring peace to Ukraine, showing Ukraine you actually are going to have to give up territory if you want peace. The war must come to an end, and if it's not going to come to an end, the Europeans are going to have to front the war. We're not covering the cost of the war anymore. We'll certainly sell arms to the Europeans who can redirect it to the Ukrainians, but we're not doing direct aid for Ukraine. That's got to be up to Europe. And if Europe wants our weapons, they're going to buy it from us. We're not going to do a loan program or a grant program. The presuppositional undercurrent for everything, though, is China. We're not prepared for a two-front war. We're not prepared to hold on one front and win on another front right now. And we're not prepared for what's coming from China that has invaded our digital infrastructure, is still within our telecom system, listening to every conversation you and I have. We're not prepared for it. And the Trump administration believes we have to be done with the distraction of Ukraine, which is a distraction in their mind, to prepare for China. I think it's a reasonable proposition, except for one thing. It is very clear at this point that China, Russia, North Korea, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, and a number of other countries have formed an alliance. They're not independent actors at this point. They're working in concert with each other, and they're working against us. And they think Donald Trump is a fool, and they're trying to play him for a fool. And they think that if Russia can drag out these peace negotiations, distracting us, it allows China time to maneuver in Asia. And I would be very weary, if I were the Trump administration, of looking on this as any sort of meaningful conversation, because I think the deal has already been struck and the die has already been cast with this Eastern Axis, and that we need to move very quickly to rebuild our military as quickly as possible. And frankly, it is in our advantage to allow the Ukrainians to kill as many Russians as possible because of what's about to come, which is this Russian-Chinese axis of power in the East.